You wrote a story digging into the numbers. What does 1% mean depending on where you live?
So, we've talked about the top 1%, and it's a term that was popularized by the Occupy Wall Street movement almost a decade ago. And we think of it as income inequality in the United States. But when looking at the top 1%, we wanted to see what it looked like in different countries around the world. And what we found was that it really depends on where you live. So in the United States, making something around $500,000 a year will put you in that top category. But if you're living in China, you only need to make around 100 grand to be in that category. But if you're in a place like the United Arab Emirates on the complete opposite side, that may look something more like $900,000 a year.
So, Reade, some of this is intuitive, that countries that are developing have a sort of bigger wealth gap or a sort of smaller average wealth. But there's also a question of how much tax policy weighs into this. What did you find there?
Yeah, so a big part of how much money you're making is obviously how much you're actually getting to take home after taxes. And what we found is the United States is around the middle in terms of where we see our location around the world. But with the wealth tax being brought up by Democratic candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, we wanted to see how the top 1% is taxed around the world. And in places like the UK and France, you see tax rates that look more like 45%. And then in other places like Monaco and Singapore that have kind of carved out this space of tax havens for the wealthy, you see much, much lower rates.
Reade, just real quick here, I'm wondering what you saw in terms of spending patterns depending on location.
Yes, so I think one thing to keep in mind with these numbers is that they are national averages. So in the case of, someone in New York making $500,000, it may feel very different than someone living in Nashville, Tennessee and making $500,000. And when looking across different countries, you see that in New York, for instance, you have to face these really high costs of childcare. You have to face high costs of living. You have to face high costs of education. And then in other places, notably in China, you see this surge in luxury goods spending. So it's expected that it's estimated that since 2012, you've actually seen spending on things like watches and purses increase by about 47%.